All right, well, it's a little bit of a dreary day out here at the Daigle homestead. But what we are going to do today is I'm going to start taking you through a little woodworking project. It's going to be pretty simple, stuff that you guys can follow along with pretty easily. Let's go to the shop and get started. Okay, well, I'm glad we're indoors now. It's still pretty dreary out. You can see the rain coming down. You can probably hear it on the roof of my my shop in here. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of take you through some of the steps for how we're going to be building this baby gate. Essentially, we're closing off the open space between my living room and my kitchen. We're going to put a baby gate there to keep my baby from getting into the cabinets and such. Midnight, the shop kitty's helping out. Alright guys, so we're looking at some dimensional lumber here. And now some of this stuff I've already done some work to. I've already got it down to sizing that I wanted it. But I wanted to kind of talk to you guys a little bit about dimensional lumber. One thing that you guys may or may not know is when you buy a something like a 2x4 or a 4x4, lumber yards and dimensional lumbers don't actually sell you a piece of wood that is 2 inches by 4 inches. So if we're looking at this 2x4 right here, right, let's look at how thick it actually is. So when it says 2 inches wide, we're going to sit here looking at this. You can see it is nowhere near 2 inches wide. It is 1.5 inches wide. Now let's look at the width. It's supposed to be 4 inches. It's 3.5 inches. So you can pretty much bet that anytime you buy lumber, unless you buy rough-hewn lumber, it is not the same width. So rough-hewn lumber means it's just come out of the mill and they haven't smoothed it out. When you buy a 2x4 or here's a 4x4, it's a post, right? A 4x4 is 3.5 by 3.5. So if we're looking at a 4x4, what I've done with two 4x4s that I bought is I've taken them in my planer and I've planed them down to a much thinner width. So if we're looking at these are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches, whereas this guy here right there is going to be 3.5 by 3.5. I just wanted to kind of talk about dimensional lumber. So on these 2x4s that are back here, I have taken them down from 1.5 inches to about 1.25 inches. Now I'm actually going to take them down a little bit further, and so that's a good excuse for me to show you guys how a planer works. Now these dimensions up in front, you can see this poplar says 1x4 by 6. It is not 1x4. Then you look down here, actual size, 3/4 inch by 3.5 inches by 6 foot. Now that's fine. That's the same with these pine, because I'm using a lot of pine and a little bit of poplar because we have an old farmhouse. And in this old farmhouse, we want to kind of keep that farmhouse vibe. They used a lot of pine back in the day. And if you do use it right, pine can be very strong and very sturdy. So we've got our pine. This is the same as our 1x4 by 6 foot poplar. However, it is not 1 inch. It is 3/4 inch thick, and it is 3.5 inches. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about dimensional lumber, and you can see how using a planer, you can get it down to a very different thickness. I thought I'd take my camera off my tripod real quick, and I wanted to show you how we're going to get it to the thickness. You can see right here, this gauge is above the 1 and at the 1/4 mark, so it's 1.25 inches. So we need to lower that down a little bit because those boards are already at 1.25 inches. So we'll release the lock, take our wheel, lower it down just a couple turns. You don't want to go too much at a time because then it ends up chewing your boards pretty good or pretty badly. This is our power switch. We'll feed the material in this way. And hopefully the cat doesn't go through it because that'd be bad, right? Get out of the way, cat. All right, so now I'm going to put this back on the tripod so you can see the process of running these boards through. Okay, so a few minutes ago we had talked a little bit about some dimensional lumber and how the thicknesses work. Typically when you buy a 2x4, this is going to come at 1.5 inches by 3.5 inches wide. Now what I've done already with this is I've planed it down to about 1.25 inches. But what I need to do with this and the other 4 of them, so all 5 of these pieces of lumber, I need to get them down to 1 inch thick. So in order to do that, I'm going to use my planer, okay? With that planer, you'll set it to the right thickness. You'll run it through. The board will go through, come out the other side. It's gonna put out a bunch of shavings because it's taking off about, 3/32 of an inch at a time. And so I'll run it through and you'll see me do this all the way through, and we're gonna get it down to 1 inch thick. All right, now you can see that I've taken off my sweatshirt because it's a little loose fitting. Remember, we don't want loose fitting clothing doing anything when we're using machines, because the last thing you want is your sleeve to get pulled in there and then pull your arm in or something like that. You'll notice I'm not wearing a tie or loose necklaces or anything like that because I don't want that stuff getting pulled in the machine either. The other thing I did was I went and got my safety glasses, make sure I keep my eyeballs safe. All right, I've already run 2 boards through because I thought I was recording and apparently I was not. So we've already run 2 boards through. I'm going to show you how to run a couple more through, and then I'm just going to stop the video because you don't need to see the whole long process because it's pretty boring. It's pretty slow. So I'll show you a couple boards, and then once I've shown you how they run through and all that, we'll just get them down to 1 inch thick, and we'll show you the next step after that. All right, you can see the process is pretty simple. The big times where you really need to be hands-on with a planer is at the very beginning when you're feeding it in. You want to make sure you get it in there level and even and all that. And then as it's coming out, you want to make sure that towards the very end you have your hands on it. That way when it's coming out, you can pull it at an even pace. That way it doesn't chop the ends of the boards too much. Okay, so that's the basics on the use of the planer. Now I'm going to take a few minutes. I'm going to shut the camera off. I'm going to take a few minutes and get these boards down to that 1 inch thick that we need. Folks, so I have gotten these pieces of lumber planed down. Now the first thing I want to show you guys is the obvious thickness difference between the two. This one here is a stock 2x4, so that means it's 1.5 inches by 3.5 in 1.5 thick, 3.5 wide. This guy here now is down to exactly 1 inch thick. And then, of course, it is still 3.5 wide. So that's the first thing I wanted to show you guys. And I know I've talked about that a little bit already. The next thing I wanted to talk to you about is when you're woodworking, there are some people, like myself, who are very interested in the grain of the wood. So if you're looking here, these lines that run the length of the board are called the grain. So if we're looking, let's say, at our what used to be a 4x4 post and is now 2.5 by 2.5, right? you can see the rings in the tree. So that's where the grain is actually coming from. It's coming from those rings in the tree. So when you're woodworking, what I like to do is really focus on finding boards with very, very beautiful grain. Because I don't paint my woodwork, I stain it or I just clear coat it, and I want to really see that grain pop. So if we're looking at this, when I was planing these down, as I'm planing them down, of course, you take off layer after layer after layer, and when you're taking off each layer, a little bit of grain gets taken off as well. But in some cases, like with these two beauties here, it reveals some very beautiful kind of wavy patterns. Or right here you can see these streaks. So these streaks are actually knots. Now the knots in the wood are kind of like this guy here, but these are very, very tiny knots that were growing vertically. So that's where the branch was coming out of the tree. And I just love the look of these knots coming out. And even these little guys here, those things are going to look so nice once I put like a nice, I'm planning on using a red oak stain, so it'll give it kind of a nice reddish, darker hue to these boards, and that's going to make this grain really, really pop. So as you're running it through a planer, which you can see how much material I took off of that thing, right? Off of these boards. As you're running it through these planers, one thing you want to pay attention to is the grain, because you don't want to end up with, you don't want to end up taking off some of the really beautiful parts of your wood, because that's what we're doing here. We're working wood. We're not just building something. No, we're building something beautiful. So even though this is going to be a very simple project, and in my house, it's not going to be permanent. It's going to be just a simple gate that's going to keep my daughter corralled for a little while. I still want it to look nice, and I take pride in my work, and you should too. So as you're going through, be aware of that. Now, what we are going to do is we're going to set up my table saw, and we're going to get these down to exactly 3 inches thick, because 2x4s, of course, come at 1.5 by 3.5. So we've got them down to 1 inch, but I want them down to exactly 3 inch. So we're going to put them down. We're going to cut it a 1/2 inch off. So we're going to take a 1/4 inch off of each side. That way we have a good clean edge on each side. Everyone say, "Hi, Midnight." She's climbing up my leg.